What's up, you guys? Today we're back with another video. Today we're gonna be installing gauges on the 2016 Subaru BRZ. Sight. Okay, so I believe it's been about a year now since I started the install video for my gauges, and it never got finished. And the reason why is because one, I was finishing up working on the engine. Two, there was a whole bunch of problems which I'll get into a little bit later about why things didn't really work. And then three, I ended up putting a turbo in my car, as you can see, and that has also caused problems to where the sensors and gauges were never properly finished, which is why I'm here today. Finish off the video finally in January of 2025 when I started this gauge stuff in somewhere around the same time in 2024. So we're gonna go ahead and dive right into the whole overview and the problems I experienced. Okay, just to give you guys a quick rundown, I have the AEM triple gauge. I don't even know what I'm saying. Right now I have AEM gauges and I have an ATI triple pod dash holder. I don't know if that's what you call it, but check it out. So these are my gauges. I have them installed on the passenger side dashboard, and I went ahead and replaced this with, again, the ATI gauge holder. Right now it's a little bit dusty, don't mind that, but I don't know if you guys can kind of see, but I have a boost gauge, oil pressure gauge, and a air to fuel ratio gauge. And I'll get into like the specifics of what I like and don't like about AEM gauges as well as the gauge holder. But basically I just want to give a quick rundown first of how I wired everything and put everything in the car. So let's start with that. So again, you saw where the gauges are, how they're mounted inside the holder. For this ATI gauge dash, you do have to get adapters for the AEM gauges because I believe they're 52 millimeter, whereas the holes for the ATI gauge dash is 63 or something, 62. It's like 60 something, and then the gauges are 52. So you do have to buy these adapters right here. I can't really tell, but it's like a little silicone or rubber that goes inside of the holes, and then the gauges itself actually sit underneath that. So you do have to buy a pack. I bought a pack of 3 just because of the 3 gauges. I'm also running the air fuel ratio, the oil pressure, and the boost gauges because I felt like that was the most important. Of course, you do want to have temperatures for your car as well, which the BRZ doesn't have. Currently thinking about putting in a 4th gauge for the oil temps. However, at the moment I don't have that right now. So oil pressure is all we are working with for oil. Now for wiring, I went ahead and took out the dash, took out my head unit, and I wired over the positive and the ground wires to my driver's side. So you guys can't really see it because everything's already tucked up, but behind this panel I went ahead and grounded the 3 wires. I just combined them all and spliced them all together, so they're currently sitting behind this right here. They're all grounded. And then on this side, you guys can't really see, but there is a fuse block. You can see that red wire right there, that's an add a fuse. For those, I put 2 of the gauge positive wires and spliced them together, and then that's running to one of the add a fuses, or I forget which fuse it is, but you have to look at the diagram. There's plenty of them online, and just choose one that will be powered when the car gets turned on. So you just put add a fuse into there, and then I did a second one for just one of the gauges. I can't remember which one, but yeah, 2 of them are spliced together. It goes to one add a fuse, and then I have one separate to an add a fuse that also goes in there. Now from the passenger side where the gauges are, I ran them through a little grommet into the engine bay to get the wires because these AEM gauges aren't plugged into my OBD2 port because I have an EQTech, so I had to actually run them to a source in the engine bay. So I ran it through a grommet back behind the battery. You can't really see it because it is dark, but it's back there somewhere. You just feed it through, comes out right behind the battery. As you can see, I have one line coming across the top. That one right there goes to the boost gauge. Plug it in. Right now I have it tapped into my blow-off valve or my brake booster. That one's that. Before I turboed my car, I had the oil pressure sensor ran to where my turbo oil feed is currently. So right here in between the AC pulley compressor, whatever, and my throttle body, there is a little oil plug right there. That's where I had the oil pressure sensor previously plugged into. It had barely enough length to be able to reach there. So I tapped into there. You're gonna have to get an adapter for that because the AEM gauges, the sensor like threading is small, so it doesn't fit into the actual port. So you do have to buy an adapter, and then you can get that plugged in there. Currently my plan for the oil pressure sensor, because it's not currently running right now, which I'll get to right now. Actually, let me kind of give you a little bit of a secret. So before, I used to have one of these, which is like a tap into the oil pressure. So this used to sit on top where the oil goes to the turbo, where that plug is. I used to have this thing threaded in there, and then the top would come out where the oil goes to the turbo, and and this side port would go towards the gauge. I thought I was pretty clever by doing that, but unfortunately the threading didn't allow the adapter to sit in the right spot, so oil would always leak out of there. I didn't think it was also a great idea because I wanted all the oil I can get coming out of there to the actual turbo itself, so I decided to scrap that whole idea. And then I bought this adapter, which I was going to use to plug into another oil port. That is the oil pressure sender for the BRZ. Doesn't actually give you numbers or anything, especially when you're looking to your car's data and stuff. It just tells you when there is oil pressure and when there isn't, which isn't very helpful at all because I ended up spinning a bearing and blew up my engine for the first time a while ago, which is why I was rebuilding it. But anyways, it doesn't really help, so I was thinking about just tapping into that using this adapter, and I could also have that oil pressure sender just in case it throws any codes or whatever. But I found out that it actually doesn't fit with the turbo in the car now. So the turbo doesn't allow for very much space between this sensor and the turbo itself to be able to fit that adapter. So I'm kind of just thinking about putting this in there, which is a extender for the oil pressure, because the sensor sits over there, obviously isn't going to reach all the way over here. So I bought that way it can reach. So I kind of figured out a way to make that run to where it needs to be, but unfortunately the OEM oil pressure sensor is not going to be able to plug in. Actually, now that I think about it, I could probably just thread it in and then thread it to the end of this one, put it down. Oh my god, I'm actually genius. If it'll reach, I don't know, I'll figure that out. But that's what we're gonna do today. I'm gonna go ahead and do that. And then let me talk about the AFR really quickly. So for the AFR, fortunately, this one only taps into where a O2 sensor is going to be. So if you kind of look at my turbo, obviously it's not going to be up on top like mine is because I have a turbo in my car. If you're going for the stock application with no turbo, no forced induction, you have two O2 sensors in here. This top one is the OEM one that is going to go into ECU and will make sure that your car's running fine and will adjust data. You usually have a second one for the OEM application. However, that port, you didn't need it because of the flex fuel kit that I am running for my car, which is the P-tuning flex fuel kit for the first gen FRS 86 BRZs. But it completely deleted that O2 sensor port, and you actually plug in the flex fuel sensor into one of the O2 sensor ports, or like it plugged into this. So basically it got rid of the O2 sensor port, and I would just have an O2 sensor just dangling in here somewhere, and the flex fuel kit plugs into this. So because of that, wasn't really planned, but I found out after, and it honestly works out so well in my favor. I use that extra O2 sensor port, which would normally not be used at all, and I use that for the AFR gauge. So again, another wire is running out through behind the battery and goes to my O2 sensor in here. So my AFR always worked. My boost pressure didn't work until I got the turbo, obviously, and my oil pressure did work for a little bit, but obviously it doesn't work now because I was trying to figure out a way to make it work. So that's why I never posted the video, because all three gauges never worked simultaneously, or when it did, it was leaking oil everywhere in my engine bay, and I didn't want to show that to you guys because I'm trying to keep this car as clean as possible. So let me go ahead and install the oil pressure sensor into that spot, and then we'll continue with the video. So after messing around with oil leaks for the past hour, I think I have found a winning combination for the oil pressure sensor. As you can see down here, I ended up using the adapter with the tap. I don't know what you would call it, but basically I ended up thinking a lot harder about it, and I blocked off the end right here, and I just used the port on the top side and the bottom side to go ahead and route both of them on there. That way I still have the old oil pressure sensor, like sender or whatever it's called, and I was able to use the other side of the tap to get my oil pressure. So kind of sketchy, not gonna lie, kind of looks ugly in the engine bay, but it works. That's kind of all that matters to me right now. Later in the future I can go back and make everything look pretty, but as of right now it works, and I just want to make sure that my oil pressure doesn't drop and cause my engine to blow up, so that's a huge plus. Next thing I wanted to get into was tips for installing any of your gauges and stuff. Tip number one, make sure that you take out your head unit right there to make life a lot easier trying to run the cables back through over to the fuse box underneath the driver dash. Tip number two, make sure to buy a adapter for the oil pressure sensor. Like I was saying here, you're gonna need the adapter to be able to fit it on there, so make sure you buy one of those. Tip number three, from the passenger side dash, the oil pressure sensor, if you do put it up here and you don't have a turbo, barely reaches into there, so it barely fits. Tip number four, if you're boosted, buy one of these adapters. That just made life a lot easier and nicer. Tip number five, when you're doing the wiring for the ground and the positive to power on all the gauges, I would try and splice them together into a tap, put that into the fuse box. Again, make sure that you're connecting it to something that turns on when the electronics turn on, and then I guess this kind of is included in tip number five too. You don't have to do it, but I grounded all three of them, spliced them together, and combined all of them into one ground. So do that, it'll make life a lot easier for you when you're installing it. For the review for that, honestly, the gauges are pretty decent. They weren't super expensive, so don't expect crazy quality out of them. So I would probably recommend, just if you want better quality gauges, it'll probably be giving you an easier time getting them installed and stuff. And I don't know, just do your research. But those are, again, what I chose. They're pretty good. Main thing is, again, it's not OBD2 compatible, so you do have to use these on the actual engine itself to read values. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit easier to do, I'd recommend getting a gauge that taps into your OBD2 if you're not already using it. Like mine, again, was being used up by the Ecotech, so I couldn't do that. Yeah, you do have to hardwire them. Because of that, the AFR gauge needs a O2 sensor port in order for that to be used, so keep that in mind when you are installing it. For the first gen BRZs, at least, I know that you can go ahead and take out one of the sensors, the O2 sensors from the OEM application, and you can go ahead and put in the AEM AFR reader or sensor. With that being said though, you are probably going to get a check engine light, which can't be coded out, I think. I'm not too sure, don't quote me on that, but if you don't code it out, if you're able to, you are going to have a check engine light, so that is one drawback. If you do end up getting the P-tuning flexible kit, again, you won't have that problem, so keep that in mind. The install for the gauges, honestly, were pretty easy. Another thing actually with the AFR, if you do put in an AFR gauge with the AEM AFR gauge, you do have to make sure that you break in your O2 sensor. For that, you do not want to turn on the electronics and let that run and then turn on your car. Apparently, when it's being used, as soon as you turn on the electronic for it, it like makes the tip of it super hot. So if you let it cook like that and then you turn on your car later, it apparently like damages the sensor somehow. So if you do use the AFR sensor, you want to make sure that you just turn on the car right away with the, let the exhaust gases go through the AFR sensor or through the O2 sensor, and your AFR should be reading correctly. I have heard with these gauges, people have had problems with quality, gauges not working and all that. Honestly, I haven't had a problem with that personally, but people have online said that, so just be careful. You can go ahead and email AEM and they should send you a replacement for whatever you have, but that is one of the drawbacks, so do your research on that. Now, as far as the ATI triple dash pod holder review goes, I would honestly say it is a pretty good replacement for your dash and a pretty good spot for your gauges. Most people I know put on the A-pillar over here next to their driving side, which makes it a lot easier to see the gauges. The reason I put it on my dash was so that it looks a little more OEM-like, kind of looks like it came with the car like this. Also, it probably won't attract as much attention from cops. If they see the gauges, they might think, oh, this guy's modified, let me have him pop his hood real quick. So I think it kind of diffuses that interest from the cops, so that's why I went with the dash setup. Overall, again, if you want to get AEM pods with this ATI dash, you are going to have to get the adapter from 60 millimeters, which is the dash size, to a 52, which is what the gauges are. And then the last thing with it is that the fitment, I mean, some mold, I'm pretty sure how they make it, so it doesn't fit perfectly. You are going to have to use a Dremel to get it to fit perfectly. I honestly haven't finished it yet, so it doesn't fit perfectly right now. I will go ahead and continue to work on that, but as far as getting the job done, it does what it needs to do, and it looks pretty sick as well, so I would recommend getting one if you do want one.
So you've got the Bluetooth gauges, Bluetooth invisible gauges. Basically, you can see right now it's running 0 pounds of boost, obviously, because we don't got a turbo in this car yet. Oil pressure gauge, yeah, it's also at 0 because we don't have an engine in this car either. What's the third gauge? Wait, AFR. Yeah, see, that's also obviously at 0 because this car runs on hopes and dreams.